And the reason I insist on calling it a regime is because these people don't believe in small r Republican principles. They don't believe that there is a common good to which they owe a moral obligation, as many Republicans and Democrat leaders leading up to this point have. They hate what the everyday American stands for.
Today I sit down with President of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. We discuss Heritage's comprehensive vision on dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, how Heritage has changed since Roberts' arrival, the 2025 Presidential Transition Project, and Tucker Carlson's last speech as a Fox host at the Heritage Gala.
Project 2025, the aim of which is to take the biggest dagger ever and place it firmly in the center of the heart of the deep state.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Kevin Roberts, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It is always great to be with you, Jan.
Well, Kevin, first of all, congratulations on this, huge event that you just organized celebrating Heritage's 50th anniversary. Your keynote was Tucker Carlson. I think it must be his last appearance before he's left Fox suddenly, and this was something none of us were expecting. I don't know, did you get any hints of this?
No first-hand knowledge about that. I even made a joke about Tucker coming back to Heritage if his then current gig went south, and that was completely in jest. But what I do know about Tucker is he's one of the visionaries of our movement, and we look forward to him landing on his feet, which I'm sure he will.
Well, but what do you think happened?
I think Fox was too focused on being the big corporate media giant and has lost touch with the everyday American. And Heritage will always be on Fox if we're invited, talking about the everyday American. We consider them friends, but Tucker is an even closer friend, and he's bigger than Fox. And the future of America really goes through Tucker's mind, if you will.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, this is the #1 rated show on television for quite some time, and by quite a margin, right? So it's kind of, you wonder what could possibly be the rationale in this sort of situation. But we are in unprecedented media times, and this is, I felt like this is something we could actually discuss because that's very relevant to what Heritage is doing.
Well, if I may,
yeah.
and I know you well enough personally and know Epoch Times well to know that you love the truth. We live in a time when the larger an organization gets, the larger a corporation gets, even if it's a friendly one like our friends at Fox, they become less enamored with telling the truth when it hurts. And what so many Americans and so many people around the world love about Tucker, they love about Epoch Times, is that you tell the truth. And dare I say, that's also what they love about the Heritage Foundation. So it's our job at Heritage, it's my job in particular at Heritage, to always sustain friendships with people who tell the truth even when it hurts, because we have a country to save.
Are you ever worried about the fact that Heritage is kind of big when it comes to think tanks? Is it maybe the largest one? I'm not sure, but I would guess it would be up there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes when people use the derogatory phrase conservative Inc., I think sometimes they're thinking about Heritage. Yeah, you know that I'm going to take the elephant in the room and put it on the table. And so I'm aware of that, but if you step inside Heritage, as you have done a few times, you know that because we're supported by hundreds of thousands of regular Americans each year, as opposed to 5 or 10 white knights inside the imperial city of DC, our DNA is to fight for the everyday American. So it's something we have to be aware of, but part of our culture internally at Heritage is to be aware of that and to check whatever impulse that may come from going to the cocktail parties that so many establishment people like to do. It's just not our jam, it's not mine, and that's one of the ways that we keep it real.
Well, since we're talking about this, something that's really dawned on me, just kind of watching what I would call systemic problems in many, many areas in our society. When things get very big, right, when the scale becomes very large, it seems to me there's this trend of they start to take on a life of their own. They start acting to self-perpetuate.
Self-perpetuation is the unhealthy symptom of a bureaucracy. And so any business, any organization is prone to that if it gets large enough. I see this most often in second or third generation family businesses, which were probably started with $100 or $1,000 that someone saved on the side and put all their chips into the table. And then by the second or third generation, because of the success of that entrepreneur, his or her children, grandchildren haven't really shared in that sacrifice. And so I think the key, having started a K through 12 school, being the second president of a small college, run 2 nonprofit policy groups, is to always have each generation of colleagues to participate in sacrifice, to know what it means, in our case at Heritage, to fight for the everyday American. When you start seeing an organization not take risks, that's a key sign. To me, it's a red flag that they've become part of the problem. They're more focused on self-perpetuation.
So I'll have to say that under your tenure, it seems to me like Heritage has started taking a lot more risks, and that it seems very deliberate on your part.
It's very intentional, every day.
What was the risk that you took that you think is the one that paid off best at this point?
A lot come to mind. My colleagues deserve all the credit for that because they're the ones in the trenches taking the risks. They're the ones getting belligerent emails from the establishment in DC about why are you taking these risks? But the one that's paid off so much is our China paper. For the better part of a year, we've been focused on making sure that the policy prescriptions coming out of Heritage relative to the Chinese Communist Party are vigorous, that they understand or they explain the stakes for free people around the world. And I will say, and no hubris when I say this, I'm so proud of my colleagues at Heritage because, Jan, this is almost literally true. Almost every policy person at Heritage, a couple hundred people, had a hand in that China paper. Our domestic policy folks, our economists, our education scholars, obviously our foreign policy colleagues, particularly those who know about East Asia, but the CCP has infiltrated nearly every country in the world, so this had to be a whole of Heritage approach to a whole of government problem, right? And it's already paying off because you see a shift in the rhetoric soon in Congress. Hopefully soon we'll see a shift in some of the legislative priorities that are coming out. And let's hope that on January 20th, 2025, we replace the very CCP-friendly president of the United States with a man or a woman who knows what time it is. And the time that it is to confront them, to defeat them, to eliminate them.
Of course, I was going to be talking about, this is the Winning the New Cold War paper. This is a very, very impressive piece of work. And the other piece that I learned recently as I interviewed one of your fellows, Michael Pillsbury, you were looking at actual past proposed bills in many cases that were offered. Like this is thinking that has been done. This isn't something that you've kind of all rehashed from scratch or something like that. But a great many of these bills that were proposed that were actually, I guess, very smart about what they were trying to accomplish just never made it. And in one case, I was told there was a bill that got past the House, passed the Senate, and then disappeared when the NDAA was passed in the end. Now that was astounding to me.
It is, and that example is but one of several dozen. And so what we're trying to do with this paper is survey the legislation in the case of that particular bill, law, that has been passed, but also in addition to that, propose new legislation that can piggyback on those good ideas. But more than anything else is just to provide an honest, objective assessment of the policy landscape. That is the problem side of policy, but as well as the solution side of policy. And so what we're hoping to do with this paper is to have built a foundation on which subsequent analyses by Heritage, by a growing number of friends in the movement, will be able to assess what we must do to confront the CCP. We're probably more than cautiously optimistic that we've made some progress here. We're actually really confident that we've helped to change the debate.
Well, I'll mention one piece which I think is very risky in this town, and that's you advocating for stopping all CCP lobbying dollars in this town. And I think there's a lot of people that like those dollars.
It's outrageous to me, Jan, that there would be any American citizen, probably within blocks of where you and I are sitting having this conversation, who would take $1 from a CCP interest. In other words, it would seem to me that someone would love this country so much and understand the evil that the CCP represents and advocates around the planet and wouldn't do that. But if it takes legislation to correct that, then Heritage is very happy to lead the way. We're not going to stop working on that issue until there is a bill that bans lobbyists in this town from representing the Chinese Communist Party.
What do you think, and we discussed it already, but what do you think would be, one or two of the most important recommendations in that paper? Because I know that you've looked at it closely.
There are several dozen recommendations. I would encourage people watching or listening to this to track it down. And I say that as the president of Heritage, not just because it's a Heritage paper, but as someone who loves this country and wants every person on the planet to flourish and knows that the CCP is standing in the way. This paper is the blueprint of how you fix it. But having said that, I think at the top of the list is recognizing that there shouldn't be CCP investment in the American military industry. We live at a time when we have supply chain issues, accentuated, I might say, by overspending on the heroic Ukrainians. But the other problem is that we have American investment in China. And so we have to be careful, those of us who like a market economy, at banning American investment elsewhere. But perhaps what we also need to be doing is reinstilling in the CEOs and corporate boards of American businesses a desire not to invest in CCP-owned interests in China and elsewhere, which leads me to the final point in terms of recommendations, because this goes beyond just the CCP. We need to be reshoring or friendshoring jobs that are in China. Americans should be benefiting by any additional military production that we're going to be engaged in order to defend Taiwan, which we will do. There are a lot of recommendations in that paper. The ones that I've mentioned are focused on the defense posture that the United States must have toward the CCP, but I'll also say we have to be really cognizant of the influence the CCP has in education. Obviously, with the formerly named Confucius Institutes that have been renamed to something else, we should not be allowing the CCP to have infiltrated our major research universities. Something
just occurred to me, this bill that we were talking about that passed the House, passed the Senate, disappeared from the NDAA, that was a bill that dealt with basically not buying drones from China, right? Which is kind of, you would think, wow, that would be
should
crazy.
Be common sense.
Right. But what I heard, though, and this is to your other point that you mentioned about nearshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, is that there just aren't a lot of options. This is what I heard from the industry. Like, let's say you want to buy drones. Where do you get them? Who do you get them? Well, it's a very serious situation in many areas, right?
No, that's true. There aren't a lot of options for drones. And yet, that's a function of our own choices. That is to say, it's one thing for Heritage and some friends to push good bills through Congress. It's one thing for a majority of members of the House and Senate to vote for that and for the president to sign it. That's one thing. But it's a much more important matter. It's a greater obligation for individual Americans, especially those who have capital to invest, to stop being worried so significantly about a few pennies of difference in investment. That is, it's more important to have an American-made drone or a drone made in a country that's a real ally of ours than it is to save a few dollars because you've made it in China. This is the kind of thing that must change in the United States. In other words, we're not going to defeat the CCP simply by passing legislation. We need Americans, and in particular American entrepreneurs, to worry about the United States first and American workers first and the future of American freedom first before they worry about, as they would tell you and me, their bottom line.
There's this idea, of course, voiced by many in the past that both of us are familiar with, that a strong America provides some higher level of security, and a weaker America, and I think nobody would argue that America isn't weaker now than it was even, let's say, definitely 10 years ago, that creates a lot of instability, not just here, but also, internationally.
Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 1980s, each passing 5 years or each passing decade, we've gotten weaker. And yes, you might say, well, we of course had the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, but I actually think those were a sign of weakness. They were the sign of a country, of a civil society that was decaying from within, that was losing its own moral authority, not just abroad, but also domestically. And so this is why at Heritage we believe this, when we're talking about the CCP and the threat that it poses, we aren't just talking about a military posture, but we're also talking about an economic and social posture. The United States is weaker, best as I can tell, in every way, but the weakest that it's become is not just its own politics, but our own society and culture, where you can't love what you don't know. And given how poorly we teach American history and civics, we have a full generation, if not more, of Americans who don't appreciate what it is about America that causes most people in the world to see us as the North Star.
I want to ask you something here, actually, because Heritage is obviously considered a conservative think tank, obviously, right? But
I hope so.
A lot of people have been discussing with me, and I like to ask this question of my guests, you know, that this conventional left and right measures, a lot of people say, well, what does that even mean? You know, actually in the speech that Tucker Carlson gave, he talks about that I'm kind of agreeing with people that I just wouldn't have even imagined, you know, being kind of on the same side with or something, say 5 years ago before COVID. So there's a few kind of alternative spectrums which have been proposed, right? One is a cognitive liberty spectrum, people that believe that you should be able to believe what you want to believe, versus people who believe you should believe something very specific and everyone should believe that way, right? So that's one. Another one is, and I've been thinking about this is the one that I'm kind of gravitating towards, is the people who have some sense of the transcendent versus people who have, or let's say purely transactional or mostly transactional. It's a very different mentality, right? It strikes me that what Heritage is doing, and I haven't seen the entirety because you guys do a lot.
It's hard to keep up with everything we do.
I'm amazed you even know.
Oh, you just assume that I do.
Is it really just for conservatives? Because it strikes me when I look at this China plan, this is not just for conservatives. This is just basic common sense.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Of course, this China plan, we would hope, would be adopted, endorsed, advocated by every American. In fact, I grew up at a time in the United States when left of center folks, you know, at that time, most left of center politicians would have endorsed this China plan that Heritage put out. So we operate that way. We talk to Democrat offices in the House and Senate, whose members I think will be real important advocates for this. To your larger point about conservatism, I will say, though, I'll just take the opportunity to mention, conservatism has always been about the transcendent. And so what Heritage is trying to do with the China paper, but even more broadly, is to say, we're just getting back to our roots as conservatives. We've always been focused on the permanent things, as we like to say, in the American and Anglo tradition. And while the free market is part of that, and the economy obviously is part of that, those are healthy symptoms of a very healthy society. And conservatives, whether they were Burke or Russell Kirk or T.S. Eliot, they're always focused, have always been focused on the permanent things. Heritage is trying to remind people that the reason you want to endorse the China paper, the reason you want to pass those bills, isn't just to defeat the CCP. It isn't just to say that conservatives in America got to win, but for every American and every human person on earth to live the good life. That's what conservatives care about the most.
Interesting. That's definitely not the common rhetoric.
No, especially in DC, because we have so many people who are former conservatives. I mean, they're no longer conservatives. They actually reject the transcendent. They reject the permanent things. Who do what? They're only focused on the free market, as if that's the totality of American conservative thinking.
Fascinating. You know, I was speaking with Mark Tapscott, one of our congressional correspondents, about he actually worked at Heritage for 6 years under Ed Fulner. And this is what he told me, where I was saying we're gonna do this interview. He said, well, you know, after Ed Fulner left Heritage, there was this perceived lack of direction, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe people were wondering what was going to happen, and that perhaps, and it seems to me that today Heritage is a very, very clear direction in many areas, right? Especially, you know, looking at this 2025, you know, transition kind of behemoth of a transition plan they can barely lift, never mind read. But it seems to me like you're very clear on what you're doing at this point. And I guess maybe I'll ask you, I wonder how much, you know, your joining Heritage, you think, has played a role in that?
Well, it's a fair question, and I'm not only grateful to, but friends with all of my predecessors. And so people know I am building on the foundations that they laid. If I've brought anything to Heritage, I think it is a clear direction. And I think that comes not from some wisdom that I uniquely possess, but something that tens of millions of Americans possess. And you pretty much have to be a human product of outside the Beltway in order to possess this, and it's called common sense. And so common sense tells someone that there's something broken about America. Common sense would then tell someone that a great, venerable institution like Heritage, which has had many great leaders and many great scholars, has material resources, but even more important than the material resources, it has soft power. It has convening power. It has influence. And what I have said is, let's use all of those things for the sake of saving America, because I actually believe we have a very finite amount of time to change course in this country. I'm optimistic we're going to do it, but I also don't believe that we have the luxury of a few decades to do it. And that's why if people observing Heritage the last couple of years in my leadership have a sense that we're in a hurry, that we're urgent, it's because we are every single day. As the first thing I said to my colleagues when I was president, announced as president of Heritage, was we're going to be on offense every day, every hour for the American people. And I'm so proud of them because we haven't stopped yet.
You know, you came from Texas Public Policy Foundation. And, you know, I learned in the years that I've been kind of discovering the conservative movement over the last years, you know, I found Texas Public Policy Foundation to be, I don't know, one of the most active groups that I come across, or like impactful in terms of, you know, crafting state policy and so forth. I guess I'm wondering how much that your tenure there impacted what you're doing now.
Oh, greatly. And you know, when I got to Texas Public Policy Foundation, it already had the reputation of being a do tank before being a think tank. And I think that reality, plus my experience in running an institution of higher education, starting my own school, kind of having an entrepreneurial background in the education world, has created, at least from my perspective, a need for every nonprofit leader in the policy space to be worried about more than just writing white papers. The papers are important. You know, we've spent some time talking about the China paper. The reason they're important is because they're the foundation on which the rest of our work rests. But the distinguishing thing about Heritage is the same distinguishing characteristic about Texas Public Policy Foundation, and that is that every word we write in one of those papers is oriented around policy change. And that, unfortunately, inside Washington, D.C., that action is really uncommon. And so what we're hoping at Heritage is not just for we ourselves to be successful with our own policy prescriptions, but to inspire some of the other policy organizations headquartered in DC on the political right to do the same.
The biggest complaints I hear about what goes on in that building behind you is, you know, a lot of inaction, a lot of avoidance of responsibility. Maybe if I do something, someone might not like it, so it's just better not to do anything. I've actually heard that from so many people over the years. It's actually kind of unbelievable. There's also this whole question of whether Congress has ceded a lot of its authority, you know, into the agencies. Some years ago, you would say the word deep state and everyone would laugh. What are you talking about? Now everyone's like, oh wow, there's something very deep in this state. I don't know if they're thinking that in those words exactly, but you know what I'm saying.
I do.
Right?
There the two things. The first is there is a lot of risk aversion inside the United States Capitol. And if Alexis de Tocqueville were here almost 200 years after he visited the United States, he wouldn't be surprised, because he observed that politicians and republics and democracies, constitutional monarchies, always suffered from a certain amount of political cowardice. And it was incumbent upon the people, their constituents, to buck them up, we might say, help them grow a spine. The result of that, to your point about the deep state, point number two, is that the deep state, the administrative state more broadly, is the rotten fruit of our individual members of Congress, our 2 senators from each of our respective states, not taking the courage, not having the courage to pass bills or kill bills on behalf of self-governance. And so this is precisely why Heritage, along with 54 other conservative organizations, 400 policy scholars, has been working so intently on Project 2025, the aim of which is to take the biggest dagger ever and place it firmly in the center of the heart of the deep state. When we do that, not if, when we do that, not only will we see the demise of the deep state, but we'll also see members of Congress be inspired to do their jobs.
What do you think right now? Because I've heard, oh wow, Congress is now taking its oversight more seriously. There's this subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. There's multiple committees focused on China. At the same time, I am seeing some, somewhat compelling opinions saying, hey, these guys look like they might just be spinning their wheels. Is there really anything happening? What do you think?
I think it took a while for them, the members of Congress, of the House, to get all of their staffs together. It took a little bit longer than I think it should have. But as we sit here, I can report that they're largely staffed up, and they've always had the intention of doing their business. It sort of goes back to the point that I made about Heritage always being in a hurry and understanding the urgency of the moment. It's also why a year ago, Heritage started our oversight project, which is designed to provide the ammunition and to some extent the personnel that those committees you mentioned need in order to do their jobs. I'm really happy as we sit in the middle of spring in 2023 that there's finally some momentum there. And it's really important as we move forward that those committees focus on the right topics of investigation and pair those with good legislation. Legislation, for example, on the debt ceiling. Legislation, for example, on border security. In other words, it can't just be about the investigations. There's some injustice that needs to be addressed. Obviously, Heritage is investing in that. But we also know from the time we spend outside DC, which is most of the hours in my week, that people are looking for an aspirational vision for the future. So we've got to pair the redressing of grievances with what we're going to do when we're fully in power in a couple of years.
Well, it's redressing grievances, but also just kind of having some kind of accountability, right, to all sorts of things which seem to have gone egregiously wrong. The Twitter files certainly exposed a lot of that, alongside multiple lawsuits which are being run. Discovery in those lawsuits has shown all sorts of activity that shouldn't be happening, whether legal or not, right?
No, that's right, and Heritage fully accepts all of that. My concern is that we get so focused on our side on the investigations, members of Congress sometimes forget to connect why they're doing that investigation with how it affects the self-governance of the everyday American. And the media does a really good job of driving the wedge between those two things. So it's more of a messaging criticism about American political conservatives, which is that it isn't enough just to do the investigations. You have to constantly explain why you're doing the investigations. It isn't just about the people who are involved in them per se. It's about all of us. There's a two-tiered system of justice, not just for President Trump, but for all of us. Ask Mark Houck, the pro-life activist in Pennsylvania. This is what Heritage brings to the table. On the one hand, the ammunition to conduct the investigations, and then on the other hand, the messaging help to remind Americans why they need to care.
It really does seem like that if you have certain political viewpoints, you can get away with a lot that you wouldn't have been able to get away with in the past. Whereas if you have other political viewpoints, you feel the full weight of the law, even when it's unreasonable for that to be the case, i.e. these, kind of SWAT teams, FBI SWAT teams being used for, situations where it's kind of preposterous.
Well, it's true. And as we sit here, do you think that there's much of a chance that any of the political allies of President Biden will have to deal with the 87,000 new IRS agents? Of course not. But those of us at Heritage, people in right-of-center media outlets, just common sense media outlets that are not mouthpieces for the regime, they have to be worried. That's unconscionable in modern America. And so Heritage, all of us at Heritage wake up every day fighting that, looking forward to the day when we can finally fix it.
Describe to me the regime that you just mentioned. What is that?
There are two elements of it. The figureheads of the regime are Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but the regime is a long-running project of the political left. It really started or was amplified in the late 60s and early 70s in the anti-Vietnam War protest of the academic left. The short version of the story is that those people have been in political power for the last couple of decades. They're members of the House, members of the Senate, executives in the executive branch of the United States. And the reason I insist on calling it a regime is because these people don't believe in small r Republican principles. They don't believe that there is a common good to which they owe a moral obligation, as many Republicans and Democrat leaders leading up to this point have. And so Heritage insists on calling it a regime because they're not focused on self-governance. They hate what the everyday American stands for. You know, we could sit here and go through the litany of pejorative ways that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Barack Obama have described people like me, gun owners, someone who goes to church. I mean, something as radical as that. They hate us. And we need to be careful not to hate them. Those of us, given our particular faith traditions, shouldn't be filled with hatred, but we do need to be filled with a zeal in the public square to confront them, to defeat them, and to make sure that they're never in power again.
There's so many areas in American life where things seem to be going wrong. Examples would be, you know, all these new rules around how elections are run across many different states, right? That have created, just as I've understood it, a foundationally different way that, frankly, the whole electoral process is even understood, right? That's one. Another area, similarly, is the border, right? There have been an unbelievable number of people, some of which we don't even know, that have crossed the border into America. And in some cases, they're even, you know, there's laws on the books to have them voting in American elections, to bring it back to elections. So, you know, we've touched on China, we've touched on a bit on oversight. Here's two kind of big elephants in the room, right? If these things aren't somehow dealt with, how can all of this, all of these other areas be achieved?
Well, the answer to your question is they can't be. So this is why Heritage has worked so diligently on improving election integrity, and there a lot of progress to report, a lot of lack of progress to report. You can go and see our election integrity scorecard and see those states that have legitimately, from objective analysis, done a very good job of addressing some problems, and we rate them more highly than others. The flip side on elections is that places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Arizona, just to name a few, will continue to be problems. And so the short version is that when we get into the 2024 election cycle, Americans can be a little more optimistic about the integrity of elections, but we are far from securing all of those problems. On the border, however, there's no progress to report. I mean, you know me well. I'm an optimist. I try to see the silver lining in every problem. There's no silver lining in this. It is awful. It is one of the worst examples of policy failure by any American president ever. And the reason it's that profound is because it's intentional. It is intentional by the President of the United States and his seemingly incompetent Secretary of Homeland Security, who isn't that incompetent. He's actually very capable at implementing what he's doing, to have 2.5 million people, at least 2.5 million illegal aliens in this country. It undermines the rule of law. It's probably permanently changed what had been very peaceful Anglo and Mexican-American counties and communities across the border of Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. And further still, as our heritage research has proven, those illegal aliens have arrived in every congressional district in this country. Every county in the United States of America is a border county, which isn't a comment about people who might come here legally. We love immigrants at Heritage. It's a comment that when you allow millions of people to cross illegally, not only are you endangering public safety, you're endangering the rule of law and the very ideals of America. Until and unless we fix that problem, as we were beginning to do in the former administration, America's future is endangered.
I keep thinking about what's been dubbed by some the disinformation industrial complex.
I love that.
Which has, grown up, let's say over the last seven odd years, to the point where there's people, studying in universities to become experts at this thing, right? And there's this effort in our society, or there's this moment in our society where some of us, and I'll say us broadly, right, believe that speech should be curtailed, believe that certain beliefs should be amplified, massively, and this is going back to what I was talking about, this cognitive liberty spectrum, right? That there's certain correct beliefs that are acceptable, and there's other ones which need to be hidden and unavailable to people to even know. And there's a whole mechanism of manufacturing perceived consensus in society. It's a very powerful, I call it the megaphone. It's a very powerful mechanism, and there's multiple organizations involved, and the media are just part of it. And there's some portion of our population also that's incredibly susceptible to it, and not bad people, not morally questionable people in some cases, in many cases, just easy to influence. First of all, do you agree? If you do, how can we have some kind of unity in a society where this megaphone can always create, incredible strife through whatever it decides to push through itself?
I not only agree, Jan, if I have your permission, I'm going to use your phrase, manufacturing perceived consensus, because that is so true. And that largely happens by our legacy media outlets, which are primarily based in New York City and in Washington. And the solution to that is for people to spend more time with regular folks outside those cities, but also inside those cities. There are a lot of regular folks in Washington and New York City, right? That is to say, watch Epoch Times, read the Epoch Times paper, but be very selective after that with the news, the national news that we're consuming, and take whatever time you're saving by no longer consuming that news and spend it with everyday people. It's why, as my staff at Heritage know, when I'm outside DC, which is most of the time, whether I'm at home in Virginia or traveling on behalf of Heritage, I always stop in a McDonald's. I always stop in a convenience store. I don't care the neighborhood. I don't care if I kind of look out of place as a middle-aged, bald white guy. Those are my fellow Americans. And you can be engaged in a conversation. My wife would say that she learns more about politics by being in the produce aisle at the local grocery store than she does reading most outlets. She's a huge fan, of course, of Epoch Times. But the point is, we should not give those people who want to use a megaphone to get us to stop thinking what we do about self-governance, the power that they have. And the only way to do that is to be a lot more intentional with the news that we consume and to be really focused on spending greater time in community. But then that still begs the question, how then do you establish unity? Well, for more than 200 years, that's how Americans consume their news, and there was a certain unity about that. Why? Because it's just scientifically, biologically obvious that humans have many things in common. And one of the things that we're hardwired to do, especially in American history, is to love our country. And the reason that we want to do that is because we love our neighbor. Isn't it interesting that these people who are manufacturing perceived consensus emphasize what divides us, what causes us to be suspicious of our neighbor? That's not what it means to be an American. So stop consuming news that says that.
So this ideology that's become dominant in, frankly, just about every set of institutions in the country. We could call it woke. We could call it critical social justice. I think that's the kind of official what it calls itself. This is something that Heritage is, I know, looking at very deliberately. So what is your work around this?
Well, I think what my policy scholar colleagues at Heritage do well, regardless of the policy arena, but in this case, and particularly confronting critical theory, is go to the root cause of the problem. And so we can talk about critical race theory. My good friend Mike Gonzalez is perhaps the leading critic of that. But the reason Mike is persuasive about that isn't just about critical race theory per se, but he goes to the origins of the ideology, which is critical theory, something that as a young history graduate student, I had to learn. So it surprises some people to know that the president of the Heritage Foundation is well schooled in critical theory. It's what he had to do to get through some liberal graduate departments in history, and it didn't affect me. But the root of that is anti-human. They are Marxist in their origins. And I don't mean that to be name calling. Conservatives need to be better, that when we use the word Marxist, we actually know what we're saying. To be Marxist is to reduce people to their immutable characteristics, their skin color, where they live, living in a certain part of the world or another. And critical theory, therefore, doesn't understand someone's soul. It is no place, if someone happens to be agnostic or even atheist, the role of nature. There's nothing about these theories that would signify that people can ever live harmoniously in a community with people who don't look like them.
Well, or are the same class, I think.
That's the same class. Right. That's exactly right.
Because that's the original way we think about Marxism, right?
So there has to be complete unanimity, socioeconomically, ethnically, culturally. I would say religiously, but there's no room in Marxism for religion.
Right, so it's uniformity across kind of an atheist.
And to come full circle in our conversation, there's nothing transcendent. And when there's nothing transcendent for a human person, that's an awful quality of life, which is why all of the advocates of critical theory I know are miserable people.
Over the coming years, you have this plan that you seem to have enacted pretty quickly, pretty deliberately, with some, fruits of that labor already. What are your most important directions right now? And also you personally, which ones are you focusing on?
Within Project 2025?
Within the overall direction of Heritage, but obviously that's a very significant part of what you're doing.
My follow-up question tells you what the first one is, which is Project 2025, because I look forward to the day when on January 20th, 2025, whoever the next president is, whoever he or she is, pretty optimistic that they'll be more conservative than our current president. We wish him long and healthy retirement as ex-president, that when he or she takes the oath of office, they will know that the full weight of the entire political right in America is behind him or her, that would not only have the policy ideas, the policy solutions, by that I mean the bills that he or she needs to push through Congress with their allies, the executive orders to implement, the rules, going back to the administrative state conversation we were having, that they must implement to undo the excesses of the radical left. But most importantly, they also know that there are several thousand Americans who have come to DC to tithe 2 or 4 or 6 or let's hope 8 years or more to restoring self-governance to the American people. That's what I spend the plurality of my time on. But the second thing, and it's very related to that, Jan, and I have to some extent helped Heritage reorient itself to be more active at the state level, is being focused on federalism. In order for the next conservative president to be successful in terms of policy, he or she has to have sort of bubbling up of ideas from the states. We can't rely on the folks in this building behind me in the Capitol to do that yet. But given in 2023, as we sit here, that it's already the most successful legislative sessions ever for conservative policy, there are a lot of great policy ideas bubbling up from the states. So I'm very focused on that. And then the third and final thing in terms of my priorities and priorities for Heritage is to take a step back from the political and policy landscape, take a step back from the frustrations we have about the two-tiered system of justice, take a step back from the daily news, and remember what's special about being an American. Remember the privileges we have to wake up here, whether we were born here or came here by choice. This is the greatest experiment in self-governance in history. And the Heritage Foundation is aptly named. We honor the heritage of the United States, not just with good policy, but by reminding all of our fellow Americans on the left, on the right, and the center what it means to be an American, and that is to live in self-governance so that we can live the good life.
Well, Kevin Roberts, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's always a pleasure to be here and look forward to more.
Thank you all for joining Kevin Roberts and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.